as beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone, for hopping on to the Business and Law Climate Hour. Really excited today just to start a conversation about climate and what it means for all the different disciplines in our faculty. So just really appreciative of everyone who's given their time to have a bit of a chat today. I firstly, just before I hand over to Colin, I just would like to do our Acknowledgement of Country, and I'd like to show this beautiful picture artwork by Samantha Hill. And we acknowledge that country for Indigenous peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships. The University of Wollongong in Australia spreads across many interrelated Aboriginal countries that are bound by this sacred landscape and intimate relationships with that landscape since creation. From Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast, from freshwater to bitter water to salt, from city to rural, the University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that has kept alive the relationship between all living things. The university acknowledges the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus's footprint and commits ourselves to truth-telling, healing, research and education. And with that, I am just going to hand over to Colin, and he's going to, I guess, kick us off for the hour. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks. You can hear me okay, I take it?
Yeah, lovely, thank you.
So thanks, BAL, for organizing this and everyone else for taking part and joining in. Just before we start, I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on First Peoples lands and to pay my respects to elders past and present and to all First Peoples that may be tuning in to watch. Now, I'm not going to be talking about law. And in fact, you can ask me at question time if you wish, but I do see that Sarah Wright's on the call, and she's in fact we don't call it a call, right? And she's a true expert on the environment and law, so I'm sure she can speak to any law issues that there are, and they are very interesting. I'm going to talk about higher education, actually, and climate change. But before I do so, I just want to note that Climate Week, it's a fantastic thing that we're doing. It's a chance for us to collectively think about what is now the greatest challenge facing us as a species, and for us as the de facto guardians and trustees of all forms of life on Earth, right? I think that's absolutely true. That is who we are. And as such, that's a huge responsibility, one that all of us must now take seriously. But let me move away from those lofty ideas to more prosaic and more personal, which is Australian higher education and climate change. Our sector faces the usual challenges that all parts of society and the economy will face from climate change. But as a sector, we will face some of them sooner and some of them more deeply. And the Australian sector in particular is more exposed than many overseas. And when I use the word sector, that really means all of us. So it's sort of a, this is really personal to our futures. Given time constraints, because I don't want to intrude upon the other remarks today, I'm going to be brief, and I'll only talk about 5 ways that I believe climate change will impact Australian higher education. So number 1, international travel. International travel at the levels of the past is not sustainable. It's a luxury that our climate cannot afford, and it is not supportable. And by supportable, I mean 2 things. I mean both the tangible support needed, but also the normative issue that it is not morally supportable to do so. As such, we need to rethink the role of international travel for academics and students, and that's domestic and international students. While the pandemic has rapidly showed us that we can survive and thrive in a post-travel reality, we should not backslide once the borders reopen. Travel for research and for networking will be significantly less likely to be supportable. And remember that word supportable, both tangibly and morally. Travel for student mobility will also be less supportable. International student recruitment will also be less supportable. These are huge challenges and changes for us here in Australia more than most. And not just because we're far from everywhere, but also because our sector has become financially reliant on international students. Number 2, our campuses. Campuses will have to change. The buildings and the transport related to those campuses will have to be adapted to the realities of climate change. Landscaping will also be less sustainable, possible, and supportable. Our beautiful campus, I'm not sure how survivable that is in a future post-climate change reality. Remote and online will become even more standard as it's less harmful to the environment. Number 3, the cost of education. Sadly, we can expect it to rise. Inputs will cost more. For example, energy and water and construction costs. Government supports and subsidies are likely to be less available and generous. You may not think they're very generous right now, but they'll be even less so in the future. And offsetting income from international students is likely to be diminished. Number 4, research. Research priorities and funding will change. Climate-related research will be preferenced. As we hit crisis points, research not related to health or the environment will be relegated even further. Research supported, and this is a strange thing to say, but the research that is supported is likely to be both more local, insular, and more global. And that seems like a dichotomy, but I can explain later if you wish. Research projects are also likely to be constrained by climate change realities. For example, less travel. Number 5, and the final one I'll talk about, are courses and subjects. Curricula and study options will adapt to climate change. More climate change issues will be included as part of subjects, which means some things will have to be dropped. More climate change related courses will appear, which means some courses will be dropped. We don't have the ability to run everything within a subject or across an entire university. So this means there'll be less other curricula, less other courses, less other subjects. What will they be that we will no longer teach? Those are some big challenges. So in other words, just to conclude, our world of higher education will, and I would say must change, and that should be sooner than later. We should start planning now for a post-climate change Australian higher education sector. And I think, well, what I've talked about sounds very negative and pessimistic and depressing. I think if we start to plan now, we can have a higher education sector that we're proud of, that achieves the goals that we want, and has adopted to the climate change realities. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Colin, for that introduction and for those nice points. I'm sure we've all jotted them down. And I think too, climate is so interconnected to everything. So, which is why I thought it'd be a beautiful chance for us today to have a look at how some of the disciplines are starting to connect their conversations with climate, especially as we know, many of our boards in Australia are articulating long-term emission targets, investing in technologies that can help us achieve decarbonising our business operations. So business are having this conversation, and I guess it's how we then bring that conversation into our classrooms and into our operations as a university. So yeah, thanks for kicking that conversation off. I am actually going to hand over first to Andrew and David. I know they're doing a team tag effort. And so I thought I might kick off with those guys. And if you have any questions, or just let the conversation flow through the chat. And yeah, we'll get started. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks, Belinda. I'll just hopefully share some screens. We thought we put some slides together because, I don't know, I guess we're stuck in the classroom. This is what we do. So I guess we weren't really sure how to approach this, but I guess one thing we know is that finance seems to cop a bit of criticism for being solely focused on money. So David and I are here to present a bit of a good news story, hopefully, about what finance is actually doing to address climate change. And so when we think about finance, a lot of what we think about is, risk and return. So investors give money to firms who then provide, some return on that investment back to investors. And so there's a lot of, risk is what we focus on a lot in finance. I think the other thing that really is coming into it now is the idea that investors don't just care about risk, they're actually caring about other things, i.e. the climate. And so we want to share some ideas or some recent research that's been done in finance that sort of touches on these aspects. Okay. So when we think about climate change, and we're thinking about these, hang on. I'll let my slides work. Okay, there we go. Historically, finance has focused on, purely sort of money motivated risk factors. Is the firm going to go bankrupt? Am I going to get my money back? And so I guess when investors now, when they're thinking about this risk return sort of relationship, high risk, high return, there's a lot of new risks that they're thinking about that are specifically related to climate change. So some of these are, the physical risks, the increased prevalence of floods and droughts and how they're affecting companies and the returns they're providing to investors. Regulatory risk, such as carbon pricing and carbon taxes that are coming in. So this is something investors are getting increasingly concerned about. And another one is sort of reputational risk. So this goes to the point of, if firms don't care about the climate, but investors do, and then clearly the firms are going to be punished by investors if they're, obviously polluting the environment. And so these are sort of some of the changes that we're seeing from the investors' perspective in terms of the risks and what they're actually caring about. And so there's been a couple of recent papers in some of the finance journals that have actually, surprisingly for finance, actually done some surveys. And so they've surveyed some academics and some institutional investors. And one of the key things they found there is that all these risks, the evidence is that they're going to have financial implications. So that's kind of a good news story, right? So even if people in finance only care about money, there's people that care just about money, they're climate deniers, they're going to have to do something about climate change because it's going to affect the return on their investment. So whether or not, they have this view that the climate matters, they're going to have to do something about it. And the other thing that came out of some of these survey papers is the idea that these risks are currently being underestimated by financial markets. So that's something I guess we can all watch and wait and see what happens over time. But there was a very strong belief that these risks aren't being properly taken into account in terms of stock prices and the like.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah. So this graph here displays the total assets under management in the US that has been dedicated to ESG over the last 2.5 decades. So particularly, they consider issues of climate change and the environment. Now, notice that there's a massive ramp up over the last decade. And so obviously this is I think this is a reflection of investors' evolving concern and values regarding ESG over time, and how these are reflected in the direction that capital is allocated. Because as Andrew mentioned, if investors have a preference, then the markets move in that direction. Okay, next slide, Andrew. So that's just to give us a quick overview of the growing importance over time. Now, when we typically think of investors, we think they only care about profit. That's probably largely true. However, there is a lot of emerging evidence that investors now more than ever have also considered non-financial factors when deciding where to place their capital. So these factors include environmental responsibility in response to climate change. So I just want to touch on 3 interesting studies, which Andrew helped me pick out, which we thought highlights the growing trend here. So a recent study by Azar in 2021 examines the 3 big investment banks. So this is BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, and their push to reduce carbon emissions around the world. Now, lately, there's been an increasing demand for these large investors to pressure companies in their portfolios to curb their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, why do they do this? Are they doing this purely out of their goodwill and their concern for the environment? Okay, sure, perhaps that might be true, partially. Okay, but reducing carbon emissions also has financial benefits. It reduces regulatory and technology risks, and alluding to what Andrew said about reputational risk, it's attractive to socially responsible investors. So the big 3 investment banks achieve this through shareholder resolutions and meeting directly with company directors. Now, the other paper, Boyer, in 2021, examines pension fund members. And rather than conducting surveys, which a lot of recent research has been doing, but we know that with surveys, it's very easy to lie. It's easy to say you care about the environment, but not really do anything about it. So this was an interesting study because they actually examined the votes of members of of a pension fund, and they were voting on real policy changes to their funds. Now, specifically, this was whether the fund should better engage with firms with regards to the UN SDGs, and which would, because they now have to consider factors outside of pure profits alone, is expected to reduce their returns. Now, interestingly, more than 2/3 of these members voted yes. So this is a reflection that members are more willing to forego some of their expected returns in support of responsible investing. So we're seeing that trend happen more and more. Now, the final paper is a very interesting one. It's by Bordoff in 2020, and they wanted to examine whether house prices in the US incorporates climate change risks. So specifically, the physical risk of flooding. So they looked at houses closer to the water and whether these were priced at a discount given the climate change risk. Now, interestingly, they found that these areas, the areas where climate change deniers live, had a smaller discount in house prices than areas of climate change believers. Okay, now you might be wondering, well, how do we define an area as a climate change believer area and a climate change denier area? So the instrument they used to identify deniers, climate change deniers, was a proportion of Republican voters in that area. I mean, there's no real surprise there, I guess. Anyway, so I thought this paper was very interesting because it highlights how investors' beliefs are reflected in asset prices, and that capital markets will begin to better price these risks as investors' awareness and concerns of the climate crisis evolves. Over to you, back to you, Andrew.
Okay, so just to wrap up, the last thing I want to touch on is, what are firms doing to actually show that they're green and that they care? And so a recent development has been a new financial instrument that firms have started issuing called green bonds. And so these green bonds are actually specifically targeted at raising money from capital markets to tackle specific, climate change issues such as, installing solar panel on factory roofs, improving water efficiency and water usage. And so the interesting thing here is the companies, when they issue these bonds, they need to state what project they're actually going to invest the money in, and then they need to continually report back to the investors on how they're going at actually achieving those targets and those projects in terms of what they're doing. There's a lot of transparency, which sometimes we don't get that much of in financial markets. So I think I've just thrown the chart in there just to sort of give you a bit of an idea about how quickly this market's grown. So, from around 35 billion US in 2014 up to nearly 300 billion in 2020. So there's huge growth. So firms are really getting behind it, issuing a lot of these instruments to try and tackle climate change. And I guess, the other side of that is the investors are there willing to buy these bonds. And so there's, we've got investors and firms really trying to do something to help tackle climate change. And I guess the last little bit of good news to finish off with in relation to these green bonds is, does it cost any more? Does it cost to be green? And the answer is no, it doesn't cost. So the interest rate that the firms pay on these green bonds is the same as the interest rate that they pay on a conventional bond. So there's actually no penalty for being green. So I guess it's a bit of a good news story to finish up on, and throw back to you, Belinda.
I think you're muted, Belinda.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, team. That was an excellent start to the discussion. Thanks for looking into that. I'm going to pass over to Sarah.
Thanks, Belinda. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that now. So I've chosen essentially to focus on two recent cases in climate change litigation that have essentially been dubbed landmark cases within climate law. So I'm going to focus on two cases, as I've said, and the first one's a case at Commonwealth level, which is the Sharma case, and that's been in the news a lot recently, so some people may have already heard a bit about it. But essentially we had 8 children bring proceedings against the Federal Environment Minister on behalf of themselves and also on behalf of other Australian children. So essentially they were arguing that the Commonwealth Minister owed the children a duty of care in negligence, and this was essentially a new duty that was being argued for, so it had never been found before in previous cases. So essentially the argument was that the applicants argued that the minister owed them this duty of care in making a decision whether or not to approve an extension of a coal mine, so the Vickery coal mine, under the Commonwealth environment legislation. So the argument was that the Commonwealth Minister had a duty to act with reasonable care so as not to cause them harm. So the argument was about the increase in coal that this extension project would approve. So the company had already had the coal mine project approved, and this was essentially an extension to allow them to remove more coal. So you can see there the arguments around the emissions coming from the coal essentially when it's burnt elsewhere. So there's an increase of scope 3 emissions from the project. So the concerns then essentially relate to the climate change impacts arising from these increased emissions and the effect that the impacts of climate change may then have on the children. So there was a couple of different types of alleged potential harm that were argued in this case. Some of them centred around essentially personal injury and death to the children. The other arguments related to economic and property loss, but it was really the personal injury loss that the court focused on in terms of finding that a duty of care was owed. So there was two main things that the court held. Firstly, the court said that human safety was something that did have to be taken into account by the Commonwealth Minister when deciding whether to approve this project under the environment legislation. The second one was about the duty of care. So it was held that the Minister did owe this duty to take reasonable care when deciding whether or not to approve the project to avoid causing personal injury or death to Australian children arising from the emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The children had also sought an injunction, so it was essentially trying to stop the Minister from granting approval to this particular project, but essentially the judge refused to grant this injunction, essentially on the basis that it was preempting the Minister's decision. So, for example, it may have been possible for the Minister to impose some conditions which would have essentially reduced the potential emissions coming from the project. I should say, sorry, from the scope 3 emissions. The Minister has actually appealed this decision. So the appeal was being heard this week by the full federal court. So we're awaiting a decision to see whether or not the full court will actually uphold that a duty of care is owed. In the meantime, the Minister has actually approved the extension project under the Commonwealth environment laws. So I can't go into it in detail, but essentially she said she's taken into account the duty of care that was owed through the Sharma case, and that she's given elevated weight to human safety within that decision-making process, but nevertheless has decided that essentially the project should be approved because it's not likely to cause harm to human safety. The second decision that I wanted to talk about is the Bushfire survivors case, and this is a decision at state level that was determined by the New South Wales Land Environment Court by the Chief Judge, Justice Preston. So essentially, this was a case centred around statutory interpretation and a particular provision within the legislation. So the argument was that the EPA had a statutory duty to develop environmental instruments, so objectives, guidelines and policies to ensure protection of the environment from climate change. And basically the argument was that the EPA had failed to perform this duty, so it hadn't actually put the relevant instruments in place. So the order being sought from the court was an order requiring the EPA to essentially develop these instruments and put them in place to protect climate change. So as I've said, it's a statutory interpretation case, so it's essentially centred around one particular provision in the legislation that sets up the New South Wales EPA, and that's the provision that said the EPA is required to develop these instruments to ensure environment protection. Now, as you can see there, it's a generally worded provision, so it's about environment protection generally. It doesn't refer specifically to climate change. So the argument then was essentially, well, what's the nature and the content of this particular duty within the legislation? And specifically, does it actually require the EPA to put in place these instruments to protect the environment from climate change? So Justice Preston held that it did, but essentially said, well, the EPA has discretion in terms of the actual content of the instruments that it needs to develop. So one of the arguments centred around whether or not an order should be made in terms of requiring the EPA to put in place instruments that essentially would help hold the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, which is the more ambitious target under the Paris Agreement. In terms of making this finding that the duty did essentially require them to put in place instruments relating to climate change, the Justice Preston had to consider, as I've said, the scope of the duty, because it was this general duty related to environment protection. So he recognised that this duty would evolve over time, given that the threats to the environment change over time. So it's not a static duty. He did say, though, at a minimum, essentially, the duty under this provision requires these instruments to be put in place to ensure protection of the environment from threats of greater magnitude and greater impact. And this was then linked to the issue of climate change. So the argument had been by the applicants that climate change was a grave concern and a grave threat at this particular time. So essentially, the court accepted that on the evidence at the current time, the threat to the environment from climate change was one of these threats of great magnitude that the environment needed to be protected against. So therefore, linking to that duty, the EPA was required to put in place instruments to protect the environment from climate change. So there was two more issues that were raised. One was whether or not the EPA had actually breached this duty. So there was a number of documents that the EPA put before the court essentially to establish that it had properly carried out this duty. There was originally over 400 documents that were raised, but essentially it was whittled down to about 7 documents. Some of those, essentially, the court said, well, it didn't actually meet the requirements of the section because they hadn't been prepared by the EPA, and that was what the section required. Others sort of had some links to climate change, but they weren't specifically targeted at instruments to protect the environment from climate change. So, for example, there were some policy documents or instruments relating to waste, but they weren't specifically targeted enough at climate change. So essentially, Justice Preston held that the EPA didn't have the relevant documents in place, and the issue then was, well, what order should be made? So there were some arguments, I said, as from the applicants as to specific content being ordered linked to putting in place those instruments so that it held the temperature below or at 1.5 degrees. But essentially, again, it was an issue of statutory interpretation, and the court held that it could only make this order requiring the EPA to develop these instruments. But essentially, as I've said before, the content of those instruments was within the discretion of the EPA. There wasn't actually any time frame placed on the order, so it may be, a few years until we actually see, these instruments coming into place. But in comparison to the Sharma case, the New South Wales Environment Minister has essentially indicated that they won't be appealing this particular decision. So it's now sort of over to the EPA to see what comes into force. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Sarah. It's just so interesting, isn't it, when we start talking about instruments and measuring our temperature rise and the impact that will have and that flow on. So hopefully you may keep us up to date, Sarah, with those cases in the WebEx chat or something. That's really interesting space. I'm going to hand over to Troy, who's definitely going to keep me under the 5 minutes. Thanks, Troy.
Hello, everybody. I've got my timer going right now beside me, and Jenny and I are going to do a presentation about marketing and climate change, and we're going to talk about some of the impacts and how some of the strategies we can use with different groups of people and how that can be a real benefit in achieving climate action through consumers. But I might start with this slide here. The beauty of marketing, and this is what I tell my first year students, it's a science and an art. This is why I love it so much. There's a science where you have to get into the minds of the customer, the minds of what's happening in the macro environment around it. Really, really understand those concepts before you do the creative, the flowery, the creative stuff to create change. Now, a subset of marketing is social marketing, and this is where us at Wollongong University are very good at. We rate really well in there and do a number of publications in this area. Fundamentally, social marketing is just behavioural change. Loss of weight, how to decrease obesity, how to combat climate change, that type of thing. Number of tools in this in social marketing, and we could be here for days talking about them. But I'm going to hand over to the brilliant Jenny Algie, who's going to talk about segmentation.
Thanks, Troy. Actually, it links in with what David was saying about the house prices and how the Republicans were still paying more for houses near the water. So this, I think, that ties in nicely with demonstrating how we've got different segments in the market will hold different beliefs, attitudes, and then translating that into behaviour. And in this aspect, it's towards climate change. So there's plenty of segmentation studies. One of the most well-known in the area of climate change is this 6 Americas segmentation. So we've got 6 different groups, and it's their attitudes and behaviours towards climate change that distinguishes each group. So Troy, if you go to the next slide, we can see, fortunately, that there is a greater number of people now in this left side of the continuum than originally that there was in the right. So we are seeing some progress in shifting along. These are US figures. The most recent ones from Australia is produced by Mark Morrison, who's at CSU. It was 2011 to 2016 where he profiled the shift. So we've got, it's not very recent figures that we have in Australia that's along this profiling line. But as Troy was saying, the blend of science and art, where the science comes in is segmenting, is really profiling the segments and then determining what is the best way of moving people along this continuum. I mean, perhaps with your dismissive, it's almost like your anti-vaxxers. They are almost a lost hope with trying to get anything to shift them from their attitudes. The climate deniers, it's just almost impossible. But what we can do is still try and work on the doubtful and disengaged and get them moving along to all of us eventually being alarmed. That would be brilliant. So Troy, next slide. So one of the articles that might be of interest for people to have a read of, this is one by Wright and colleagues, that the acronym is developed and it comprises the word shift, all the little components of it. But these, within each of these categories, are tactics or strategies that could be used by marketers to try and encourage people to engage in more sustainable behaviours. So obviously time constraints doesn't allow me to go through all of these points, but we're seeing some development in this area of marketing of how can we change people's behaviours. And Troy, next slide. So the 6 Americas is a segmentation tool. Stages of Change is like a traditional segmentation tool in social marketing and health promotion. So maybe one of the areas for future research that we need to look at is what are the best approaches for these different segments, because one approach won't work for all. So we could combine those shift strategies and work out which works best with particular segments. So that was just sort of where I think there needs to be more research in this area about combating climate change. Over to Troy.
Okay, so now the creative side, you can see some interesting creative designs there relating to climate change. It's not just all about advertising. Marketing is not just advertising and selling. It's about finding out what the consumer wants and really trying to get to them and try to get to them in an effective way. So using that 6 Americas, looking at each of those segments and working out what's best for each segment is a way to go forward with climate change. And as we can see, there is a strong shift towards from the denier side up to the alarm side. Now, as Jenny said, as I said before, you don't teach a pig to sing, it wastes your time and annoys a pig. Same with the deniers, really, let's not waste our time. They will shift across in a set time. It's the other people that are the important people to move across. Marks and Spencer's do this really well in the UK. They've had the plan A because there's no plan B. And what they're finding, and Andrew said this too, there's money to be made here. Yes, it's good. And yes, customers want that from their business. And that is good because they're saving energy and they're getting more customers in because it resonates with the brand. The target market resonates with the brand and what the brand stands for. So I know I'm just about over time. So the one I like is the Rebel Whopper from Hungry Jack's. I'm a vegetarian because of climate change reasons, but I love sort of meat, at least this fake meat. And I think there's really a good strategy from them because most times on a masculine feminine scale, climate change was seen, particularly in America, on the feminine side. But this is a major business, Burger King's coming out and saying, no, we're going to call it rebel. The word we use, the people they used in their ads to promote this plant-based one, which I think is lovely with a Coke and chips, and I feel sick afterwards. That's perfect. I think they did really well in there in positioning it right and taking the risk and saying, look, this is how we're going to position this product. And I think that's strong. Now, to finish off, we've just submitted this paper to energy policy. Please, we've just submitted this to energy policy. It has not been accepted. With Michael, who's on today, and Jen, and Seb, and myself, and Ben. And what we're looking at is the barriers to energy efficiency and climate policy in Australia. And Jen had a really good idea for a title. It's not us, it's them. And all our research came down to it was a bloody federal government. Everything came down. If you look at all the research, people want climate change. Any way they want it. Australia's the worst emitters in the world, came out on the ABC again today. People do want climate action, but using the influence of vested interest, coal and lobbying and all that, the media, Murdoch, Uncle Rupert, the government has used every trick in their book to slow or limit any tangible climate change. But don't worry, because there's a concept in social marketing called tipping point. And we've been doing all of us here, we've been doing the hard work, banging this drum, pushing this agenda, and it gets to a point, like everything does, like smoking and cancer and all that, where it tips over the edge and everybody gets on board. And I can see that light at the end of the tunnel coming. Thanks.
Thanks, team. Wonderful. I can see Karen's conversation there in the chat from SMAR. I'm sure she'll be calling you very shortly to have a discussion with her students, which is great. And I really thank those who have come into our gorgeous, beautiful faculty from outside our faculty, just to see how amazing the work and the conversations that we have in business and law and how integral they are to all other discussions that are going on. So that's wonderful. Thanks so much for that. Alfredo, are we up for an economist chat? Hang on.
Yeah, now I got it. The screen is working. Yeah. No, don't worry. It was me. It was me. Yeah, so it's the slide there. I can't see actually whether the slide is there. It is, yeah, there. Cool. Yeah, so for those who don't know me, I'm Alfredo Paloyo, and I'm a senior lecturer in economics at UOW. And I'm very grateful to Belinda and the rest of the organizers for allowing me to represent economics today. And I want to talk about two extremely significant topics. One is, of course, climate change, and the other one is the Netflix series called Squid Game. And I assume everyone is familiar with climate change, but if you're not familiar with Squid Game, where the hell have you been? Squid Game is Netflix's most watched series to date. And the premise of the show is that people who are deeply in debt are recruited to play a series of games from their childhood. If you lose, you die, and winning means financial freedom. And the show has persistent themes of poverty, fairness, betrayal, and greed. And these issues speak to how our shared prosperity today is built really on the backs of those who will come after us on this planet. But for all the pomp and pageantry of Climate Change Week, the survival of the planet hardly depends on Australia. Shutting down the entire country would offset less than a month of China's emissions. For Australia, the case for robust climate action is not a matter of planetary survival, but rather largely a moral one. It has very little to do with not driving a car or buying local food. What we require is radical decarbonization, a drastic reduction of emissions of the biggest global polluters. That's why the commitments to net zero by China, Japan, South Korea, the EU, and the re-entry of the US into the Paris Agreement are positive news. These are our largest trading partners, and they will shut out Australia from ever being on the right side of history if it does not do the same. But the key to success is the reason why it is so difficult to win the battle against climate change. It requires every nation to absorb the costs associated with the path to net zero. And that means the incentive to free ride on the efforts of others is strong. So we must make the free riders pay. Both the EU and the US are on the verge of implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism to prevent carbon leakage. This will heavily penalize their trading partners, which refuse to align with their ambitious climate action. Yes, there are costs on the road to net zero. You may try to hide it, but someone will eventually pay for it. As it is in economics, so it is in life. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Yet Australia will also pay dearly for climate inaction. It is better to pay for the cost on our own terms, in lockstep with our allies, than to be dragged kicking and screaming. Economists have long argued that the least cost way of achieving our target emissions is through a carbon price. It's not even close. All other methods are more costly and involve overreach from the same government with a poor track record of picking winners. I give you the example of the NBN, which is now obsolete given the advances in wireless technology. And how much did the NBN cost again? And what about AstraZeneca? You remember that? Australia flirted with a carbon price for a while, but I believe the stars are aligning for us to try again. If you think a carbon tax is a political non-starter, think again. The GST was initially rebuffed, but we eventually passed it into law. With the immediacy of the climate crisis and with the lessons learned from the past, we may yet see a carbon price in Australia within the next decade. In Squid Game, fairness is paramount. Cheaters are killed swiftly. We have to be upfront about the costs of net zero. Some sectors will suffer more than others. It's easy for us here to pontificate in our ivory tower, to tell industries that your time's up, pack away your things and move along. But these are two of my very dear friends. They are coal miners. I have about a dozen of them. If we are to play the climate change game, we must be fair about the transition. Fairness only to some, but not to others, is not fairness at all. We must help those that will pay the highest price. Otherwise, we will never be able to muster the broad community support necessary to ensure we can repay our debt to the future generation. Thanks.
Thanks, Alfredo. That was some excellent, some really good points, and just to bring it back to reality a little bit, especially about our country now and our thoughts forward. And we do need a mass amount of money to invest in the technologies that will help us decarbonise. So thank you so much for bringing the economic lens on our discussion. Irit, are you okay to give us a bit of a management perspective?
Hi, thank you for setting this up, Belinda. That's fantastic. And I feel like I'm going to fall very short of all the other presentations we've seen,
No.
but I'll do my best.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Irit and I'm a lecturer in management. And I've had a couple of projects that had to do with climate change, and there's a lot more research out there than mine. So I try to kind of talk a little bit knowledgeably about what I do know. Sorry, let me just launch this so that you guys, can you still see it? Can you guys see the slides? Yeah, okay,
yes.
Cool.
Yeah,
awesome. Thank you. Okay, so we kind of wanted to look at management from a strategic focus. So companies that will take a strategic focus on climate change, and private organizations, as Troy spoke of the tipping point, they definitely have joined the battle on climate change and climate action movement. Woolworths is just one example I put here of a company that had a major transformation within itself from a different kind of focus into more, how do we support the planet, realizing that without a planet and without a healthy planet, they can't really do business, which is good. So what we're kind of seeing is that not all companies get involved in the same way. And the company's involvement is not homogeneous. So a company is not like one homogeneous entity. And if you think of it, even a human being has kind of different voices within them. Certainly a company that has multiple people and forces in it is the same. So some companies take a holistic view of climate issues as part of their corporate social responsibility. And some companies embed climate response into their strategy. So Osgrid, for example, which is a company that, you know, depends on energy and has to manage energy, but that's part of their considerations, is how do we, you know, how do we do this in a way that's sustainable. The international community does provide reporting standards, and subscribing to these reporting standards is something that benefits the company as well. So I just thought I'd give a couple of examples of studies that I was involved in. So one of them was disaster relief. And what we did is we looked at how different private companies get involved in disaster relief. And if we look at the 4 stages of disaster relief, so prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery, there's all sorts of things that companies can and do. So some companies look at reducing their greenhouse gas emissions as a strategy of prevention, and look at environmental management and what they can do with, you know, plants and biodiversity. In terms of preparedness, companies are very good at establishing procedures and building their networks with other entities that are better at doing that. In terms of response, the way companies involve their employees vary. So companies can involve employees to different extents. And I guess I feel like our organization, our faculty, our university is definitely the highest level of involvement of employees, where employees can champion and lead things and kind of get supported in developing themselves while they're developing their ability to respond to societal needs. And then the recovery stage, that's an interesting one, because most companies get involved in disaster relief when there's a photo op, you know, when the disaster strikes and the media attention is high and everybody remembers. But then, you know, when you need to rebuild things and recover things, the cameras are away, and the companies that stick by are the ones that are more genuine about it. And there were previously talks in this session about how genuine companies are, and we found that there are 3 kind of typologies of companies and how genuine they are in their involvement. One being kind of, you know, reactive is how we called it, and that's a paper that's hopefully gonna get published soon. But one is reactive and kind of going, oh, okay, we'll just do things while it's hot. Another one that's a bit more strategic and goes, okay, how do we best support disaster response? And then there's companies that we called, I think we called it effective, and it's just a more comprehensive view where they go, how can we make this whole disaster management thing across all 4 stages? How can we improve it? And how can we expand our ability to respond? And another example I thought I'd share, and it's not us, it's them. So that was that Troy? Yeah, that was Troy and Jenny's paper. So I worked with them a little bit, and New South Wales government, and they are also not one unit. So we found that there's a typology of, we found 5 types of government agencies and how they look at what they call resource efficiency. So they didn't call it sustainability or climate sustainability or anything. They had to use a language that was in line with their political party that didn't want to talk about climate change. So they called it resource efficiency. And we found that there are 5 different types. One that was led from the top, where the senior management of those agencies was going, we're going to be climate responsible or environmentally responsible. Then we found that there were companies that were actually led from the middle, that it was not the top management, but it was kind of the middle management that was selling it up all the time to their executives. Then we had agencies that we called them ripe and ready, where they had everything in place. They had all the policies and all the resources, and people were ready and everything, and they just haven't quite clicked into it. They were kind of about to explode. Then there were companies that were kind of compliant, agencies that were compliant, and they would do whatever was required, but they had no drive to improve. And sometimes it was because they couldn't see anything else to do. Like, they've already done most of the things that were, they've already done the 80%, and the next 20% were just way too much effort than they could have done, and very under-resourced sometimes. And then there were agencies that were very, very not engaged and not interested at all. And if anybody's interested in the dimensions that we found, I've put them in the slides here. So what do they mean? But I think that will take me over the 5 minutes. So in terms of higher education, businesses are the ones that are responsible for the problems, and therefore they can be and need to be part of the solution. So when we're raising our graduates, it's obviously important that we make them aware. So if we put examples or things that have to do with climate change in our teachings, that's one way that I found. And I actually changed the textbook from one strategy textbook that I was working with that was incredibly profit oriented into one that was explicitly about social and ethical responsibility, accountability. So if we teach our students that at some point they will be accountable, as Alfredo said, there's no free lunch. And if we develop the authenticity of not greenwashing. So I thought we could have a discussion. So I'll have a quick look at the chat if there were any. Oh, there's a lot of comments. Anything about, how should our curriculum reflect this? I don't know, Belle, do you want me to facilitate a discussion on this or just move on?
We probably may not have time today, but I think it's definitely one we need to have in the future, if that's okay. And if I'd love you to organise that, that would be wonderful.
For sure. Well, so it was kind of more of a reflection point of how do we include elements in our teaching to reflect the importance of climate change. So I'm really pleased to see with the change of leadership in our university that things like the Global Climate Change Week, which we used to have to battle for a few years ago, now it's kind of mainstay. So that's great news.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Irit. Yeah, definitely. David brings us back to Colin's first opening statement. We are going to finalise our presentations today with our Deputy School of Business, Millie. I'm going to hand it over to Millie for a chat.
Okay. Thanks, Belle. So what I'm going to talk about today is really how we find out about what companies are doing in their individual operations, whether they're harming the environment and how they're tackling these climate change issues. At the moment in Australia, it's voluntary. The disclosure of their activities is still voluntary. So there has been huge demand from investors and other stakeholders for increased transparency and consistency in the reporting of these activities. And so what happened in 2017 was the Financial Stability Board established the task force on climate change related disclosures to provide recommendations for disclosures to allow stakeholders to make better decisions with their investments and other activities. What is different from the TCFD disclosure is that it requires disclosures in 4 broad categories. This include governance, how the board, for example, is monitoring these activities in terms of strategy, what they're doing about the risk and opportunities and resilience to climate change issues, risk management, and metrics and targets. So traditionally, companies reported on their metrics, such as greenhouse gas emissions. But these other areas of disclosure are relatively new. And as you can see, they're relatively would affect firm value in terms of giving up on some competitive advantage. So I refer to I should go into screen mode. I refer to the latest status report on the TCFD take-up. It's not surprising that disclosure has increased in the last 2 years to the previously assessed years. More than 89 countries have signed up to TCFD as TCFD supporters, and this translates to about 29,000 companies. But it's really in what they disclose that they vary. So only 50% of these companies disclose in at least 3 of the recommended disclosure areas, with strategy being the most disclosed and governance being the least disclosed. So this is a worry, in fact, because who is monitoring the strategy and risk management activities within the firms? Not surprisingly, materials companies and building companies, being high emitters, lead the disclosure, while insurance, the insurance industry has been a significant improver in their disclosure. And again, not surprisingly, Europe is leading the region for disclosure, where recently many countries have signed up to mandatory disclosure under the TCFD alignment, including Brazil, Singapore, and even our close neighbor, New Zealand. What I want to highlight here is it's a thesis of one of my PhD students, Dong Ding, whom I'm supervising with Bin Liu. So disclosure is all well and good, but what drives firms to disclose their climate-related information? And so Dong is tackling this question, and one of the factors he's looking at is carbon emissions, i.e. do firms out themselves in terms of emissions? And this was a cross-country study, including Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US. And he found that the high emitters were the ones making more disclosure. So this is not surprising given legitimacy concerns and institutional pressures and political pressures to disclose. More interestingly, when we look into the categories in which firms disclose, we find that Canadian firms do the best. They disclose in all 4 categories, whereas UK firms do well as well. They disclose in terms of governance, strategy, risk management. So bearing in mind strategy and risk management deal with climate risks and opportunities and resilience, and how whether firms are able to measure this risk. Not surprisingly, we've got the laggards, the countries lagging behind in the disclosure in Australia and the US. Whereas in the previous slide, I showed you that Australia was very high in the levels of disclosure, but it's not in how much they disclose, but in really what they say about the disclosure that matters. So to conclude, we find that the good news is, and I'm following on with the good news stories told by David and Andrew, that there is increased disclosure, but more importantly, managers are held to account for their carbon emitting activities, and in disclosing more about what they are doing in the future in terms of strategy and risk management to counteract these emissions.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm mindful of time, and I know we're right on time. Again, just I really enjoy how, something around, the reason I love the Sustainable Development Goals framework is because no matter which global challenge you choose, it can bring us together to have this beautiful interdisciplinary conversation. And something like climate, from what we can see today, interests us all in so many different ways, and yet so interconnected in the discussions that we're having. So hopefully we will, obviously our future decision makers are in our classroom. So I'm just so happy that these discussions are going on, and hopefully we'll get to work together a lot more on this issue as we move forward. I just wanted to end with I was in a presentation a couple of days ago, and it was a Wollongong City Council one, and Gordon Nurse was speaking, and he was saying that in most species, gender is determined during fertilization. However, the sex of most turtles, crocodiles, alligators are determined after fertilization. And I was like, I wonder where he's going with this conversation. And it was really interesting because he was talking about how, turtles lay their eggs in the sand, and the temperature of the sand at the moment is obviously rising. And at the moment, there's currently about over 90% of turtles that are being bred are female. And so we are very, very quickly eliminating male turtles. Now, don't worry, guys, I'm sure that's not going to happen in the human world, heaven forbid. But I did think it was interesting in terms of the decisions that we're making in business and the impact that they're having, on just the smallest thing in our world, and this beautiful animal. And we are very slowly changing the way that we evolve. And I think it will just be an interesting space to keep that mindful, I think, in our classroom and the decisions that we're making. So I thank you so much, everyone, for coming along today. The session's recorded, so we'll pop it up on our webpage along with the other resources. And yeah, I'll see you soon. Bye.